All right, folks, let's get organized. At least the folks over here. We don't have hardly anybody over here. Open up to 1 John chapter 3. And if you're new and don't know where 1 John is, find Revelation at the end and go back a couple of pages. You'll find it. We're going to get started around 1 John 3, 16, more or less. Here in a minute. Dave, could you shut the door? Thank you. In case you still have your coats on, it's not quite up to 70, but it's getting warmer. It'll be nice in here. One time we had a discussion in this class before about why have we not studied this book? And I think there's a number of reasons. We talked about them. 2nd and 3rd John and Jude are really, really short, like one page. 1 John is actually longer than a number of the books in the New Testament. And I think this surprises people because they think it's going to be one of these short things and it goes, for some pages. 1 John is longer than Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, or 2 Thessalonians. And I've been in classes like with Ephesians and Philippians that we would spend 6 months in that one book. And I hope that by now, as we've been reading this, if you've been reading along, you see that John is not written the same kind of way as those books. And I don't think we've ever talked about why, but if you think about any of those books, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, many times they maybe have kind of one topic, like 1 John has. What's the one topic of Galatians, by the way? No, not you, Nathan. He's entirely too eager. Yeah, but that's his answer to everything. Tom, what's the one topic of Galatians? Yeah, why? But just more words than that.
Well, it's helping the new Christians understand that they can't be justified by the old law.
Yeah, old law or just by works. Can't be saved by works. Sure. Okay. And so there's one topic. Now, 1 John kind of has one topic too. And if you haven't learned what that one topic is, you haven't been here. You're kind of rubbing it in, aren't you? So at any rate, 1 John kind of has one topic, and in kind of a review, because we're just getting started here, I got to thinking about how he talks about the Gnostics in 1 John up to where we are, which is 1 John 3. In 1 John 1, he doesn't really specifically complain about anybody. He says, if the one who says, the one who keeps the word. And he always talks like this. So it's real general. You don't have an idea of who is doing this. But in 1 John 2, going down to verse 18, that's when he first starts nailing in more clearly who he's talking about. So I'll just read 1 John 1:18. Children, it is the last hour, and just as you heard that Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have arisen. From this we know it is the last hour. And remember what we said Antichrist means? Antichrist. It means against Christ. And he gives them a name. He says they're the people who are against Christ. Okay? But this is where he actually names kind of who he's talking about. And then I've decided to go through from there to where we are now in 1 John 3 and see what else did he say about them. Well, that's 2:18 that I read. 2:19, he says they're not one of us. Verse 22 and 2, chapter 2:22, he says they're liars. In verse 26, he says they're trying to deceive you. In 1 John 3:8, he says the one who practices sin and that's who he's talking about, is of the devil. And then he gets more specific about that in chapter 3, verse 10, where he calls them the children of the devil. And then goes on in the same verse to say they do not practice righteousness and they do not love the brethren. So as the book is going on, he's getting more specific and clear as to who he's talking about. And as I've said to you numbers of times, including last week, what's the thing that makes it, to the readers of 1 John in the first century, what was the thing that made it very clear to them exactly who he was talking about? It's one word that he uses over and over. Not Gnostic. The word Gnostic is in the text, but it's not translated as Gnostic. It's the word for know, K-N-O-W, which is gnosis, G-N-O-S-I-S in Greek, or ginosko is the verb. And it's how many times is it found in this book? 22 times. Every time that a Christian reading this book came across either gnosis or gnosko, that Christian knew he was talking about the Gnostics. And some of it is, I read this to you one time, and I don't actually remember where the verse is now, but sometimes it's actually done in kind of a sarcastic way when you're reading it in the Greek. I don't mean sarcastic like John is a bad person. I mean he's saying, I'm talking about these folks and you know who I'm talking about. In other words, he's nailing it down pretty hard as to who it is. Okay, anyway, any comments on any of that? Last week we had read 1 John 3:11 through 18, and we were going through the verses, and we got down to verse 16 or 17, and so I'd like to pick up with you on that. These verses we read last week. Well, I'll read, since I'm starting at 16, I'll just read 16 through 18. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoever has the world's goods and behold his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? Little children, let us not love with word or with tongue, but in deed and truth. He's talking about loving your brethren, isn't he? And he means your brethren in Christ, right? We got that last week? Okay, verse 16. We talked about this some. He laid down his life for us. Who's he? Christ. And we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. Have you laid down your life for anybody lately? No. And hopefully we never will have to, right? But many times in the Bible when it talks about sin, it talks about the worst of all the sins so that people know the depth to which sin can be. And sometimes here, when, like here, John says, we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren, were any of them right then having to lay down their lives for the brethren? No. That came later on in the first century and in the second century. You know, when the Romans would throw the Christians into the Colosseum and let the lions eat them. That's not just a Hollywood movie. That kind of thing really did happen. And sometimes happened every day. The Colosseum was open daily for any Roman citizen for free. It was like going to a movie every day for free, you know, and it was entertainment. You got to see athletic competitions. They could flood the entire inside of the Colosseum with water and have boats out there doing things, including boats of men fighting men in another boat. But one of the things they did for entertainment was having gladiators fight each other. Many times it was not a fight to the death, but sometimes it would be a fight to the death. And when the people of Rome knew that it was going to be a fight to the death in the gladiator at the Colosseum, the place would be packed. They wanted to see somebody kill somebody. And sometimes when it was involving the Christians, it wouldn't just be one or two, it would be numbers of them. There could be 20 or 30 Christians would come out there one at a time or in groups, and you would have gladiators come out there and kill them. The Christians were not armed. The gladiators were armed. Not quite fair. Or lions, wild animals. They really did it. And the people would, scream and holler. And if you've watched any of these Hollywood movies about that time, if it was a fight and one of them knocked the other down, like two gladiators, what did this mean and what did this mean? This meant, don't kill him. This meant, kill him. And the crowd would do it in unison. Maybe 10, 30,000 people would be up there going, yay, he gave you a good fight, so don't kill him. Or boo, he was no good, kill him. And then the gladiator would follow what the crowd said. But guess who was the ultimate decider if the crowd wasn't all united? Caesar. Because the emperor would frequently be at these things. And if they couldn't quite agree in the booing and yaying and this, that, and the other, they'd look to the emperor and he would do a thumbs up or thumbs down, and the guy lived or died. Anyway, okay. Now, do Christians sometimes have to put their lives on the line or lay down their life for their brethren today? Yeah, not here. Aren't we really happy? But I thought about a story in my life, and no, I was not in that case, but it was where I had to make a decision of if I was going to possibly put myself in that situation. I told you I traveled around Europe for 3 months one time in the summer of '73. And a lot of you remember Otis Gatewood. How many people here knew about Otis Gatewood? Probably most everybody. He was the first president of the college down in Rochester. Now, I heard the guy talk, and I liked him, and he inspired me in a number of ways. But I really became friends with his son, David. And when I was traveling around Europe in '73, David was a missionary in Zagreb, Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia doesn't exist today, but it was behind what we call the Iron Curtain. And David knew I was coming over to Europe, and he said, why don't you come down to Zagreb and visit me? And it scared me to death, because I just knew if I went behind the Iron Curtain, I was going to land in jail somehow. And that was the last thing in the world I wanted to do. So I didn't go. I chickened out. I couldn't do it. And David was sorry I didn't show up. And David and I were friends. When he came back to the States, he came to Memphis, and I picked him up at the airport. And this has nothing to do with that story, but I'll tell you anyway. Guess what the first thing he wanted to go do when he came back to the States? He wanted to go see a movie. And it was The Godfather. You couldn't see the movie in Europe, especially in Yugoslavia. And he'd heard so much about it, he wanted to go see it. And I don't know if you remember, when the Godfather movies came out, they got more kind of gross, I think, or whatever as time went on. But the first one was just a killer at the end of the movie. I mean, it stunned people. People cried, and people got tears and upset and everything, And he went in to see the movie, and he was kind of smiling. He's back in the States in Memphis, and he's going to go see a movie he'd been wanting to see. He came out of the movie at the end, and he came over to the car, and his face was like this. Oh, my goodness. He couldn't dream of such. He'd never seen a movie like that before. Yeah. And by the way, in case you're wondering, David ended up being a Christian counselor for people in Chicago, Illinois, which is where I think he lives now. David Gatewood, I really liked him. Okay. At any rate, I chickened out. I was not going to go behind the Iron Curtain when I was traveling around Europe. But I did. I was in a boat one time going from Italy down to Greece, and it went along the coast of Albania, which was communist. Oh, my goodness. I've never seen a more desolate place in my life. There was a road right along where the boat was. It was a big boat, but we were pretty close to the shore. And along this road, there were just no cars. There were some military vehicles came by, and there were some cargo trucks and stuff like that. No private cars, no people, no telephone lines, no power lines, almost no buildings. I thought, this is not a nice place. I was really glad the boat wasn't stopping anywhere along that coastline. That's as close as I ever got to that kind of thing, and I didn't like it a bit. Okay, anyway, but there are Christians today who are in danger today. Oh yeah, I didn't tell you the reason why I told you about David Gatewood. In Zagreb, there's the Church of Christ, where David worshiped. That church changed their place of meeting every week. Because if the police found out they were meeting and where, they would come and arrest all of them and put them in jail. How do you do evangelism in a country that has secret police and pay people to inform on their neighbors? You do evangelism very, very carefully. Because what are you going to do? You tell a person about the Bible, and then next week the police are knocking on your door and take you to jail. Or you invite the person to worship. And the person tells the police, and they show up and takes everybody to jail. This wasn't just talk. It happened. And the Christians in Zagreb were constantly having to move where they met because of this. And keep it secret. And if they tried to talk to anybody about Christ, they had to make sure that they weren't lovers of the communists. Which is, kind of hard to know sometimes. Okay. There's probably 100 other stories we could talk about that kind of thing, even today. You remember in Nigeria when 3, 4, 5 years ago they kidnapped this whole school of girls? It was 240 or something of them. And they took them away, and then here in the last 6 months or so, they got a bunch of them back. They paid a ransom, and a whole lot of these girls came back. In a very few of those stories, they said that about half of those girls were children in families of churches of Christ. If you didn't hear that in a story, that was not said in a lot of those stories. But this is Nigeria, where we have lots of congregations. We have over 3,000 congregations of a cappella churches of Christ in the country of Nigeria. And some of them are large. In some of the cities, we have congregations of churches of Christ that are over 1,000, that have elders and deacons and buildings and everything that we have here. But in northern Nigeria, where it's much more Muslim, it's in contest. The Muslims want everybody to be Islamic, and we're out there doing evangelism, and other churches are out there doing evangelism also. And why did they kidnap the girls, by the way? For ransom. They wanted money, but there was a second reason, and they said so. To convert them, but more than that. Yes, to convert them, yes. But convert them in what way? They wanted to marry them off to Muslim men. And some of the girls did. They had told the girls that if they didn't, they would kill them. And some of the girls said, kill me if you're going to kill me, but I'm not going to marry the guy. I'm not going to be converted. And so they didn't get all the girls back. Some of the girls went with the guy that they forced them to marry. Oh, yeah, and they didn't give them a choice to who they married either. They made up their mind as to who they got married to. Not a nice world, huh? And that's today. Northern Nigeria has been in the middle of a informal war, I guess, between the Islamic militants and the government for years now in northern Nigeria. And they kidnapped some more here within the last 6 months. It didn't talk about the religious. I don't think that was a religious school in this last time. But the first time, half of those girls were children from churches of Christ. Okay. All right. Lay down the life for the brethren. So was he saying that we all should be prepared any day to die for another Christian? That's not really what he's saying. And we know that by the very next verse. The illustration that he gives of lay down your life for the brothers in verse 17 is not about dying. It's about food and help. Verse 17. But whoever has the world's goods and behold his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? How does the love of God abide in him is a rhetorical question. You know that. So what's the answer to that rhetorical question? The love of God does not abide in that person if he doesn't care for his brother, okay? But the illustration is of a brother who needs help, food, shelter, clothing. That's his illustration of lay down our lives for the brethren. Help people who need help. Any comments on 16 and 17? Oh, yeah. One other thing in these sections here. Did you notice the word brethren or brothers? One time years ago, I wanted to keep that separate because I wanted to make my point about, love your brother and that kind of thing. One time I was in a class and one of the ladies raised her hand and said, "Why do I keep hearing about the brethren and don't hear about the cistern?" And that was a good question, okay? And we're going to get the answer in a second. Now, today in the woke world, somebody would say, "I hate the patriarchy." In other words, everything all about the men, okay? So, if any of you are in the Pew Bible, this is on page 1859, where we are, 1 John 3. I want to show to you a little note at the bottom of that page. If you're getting it out, page 1859. It's 1 John chapter 3. And the note at the bottom says, you with me? The Greek word for brothers and sisters, adelphoi, refers here to believers, both men and women, as part of God's family. Now, here's where I want to kind of surprise you a little bit. It says verse 13. If you go back to verse 13, it says, "Do not be surprised, my brothers and sisters, if the world hates you." Okay? But you notice the Greek word that they refer to down in the note is adelphoi. That's one word. Adelphos, is the word for brother, as in male sibling. Okay? But words can have original meaning, like brother, and it can also have extended meanings, which is why here it says in verse 13, in the NIV, "Do not be surprised, my brothers and sisters." Now, "and sisters" is not in the text, and there is another word for sister. But the reason why the NIV puts that is because, as the note says, when he says brothers there, he doesn't just mean males. He means males and females. So the answer to why we have brethren but not sistern is because brethren includes the women. The word includes women as well as men. Okay? So sometimes when people talks about the patriarchy in the Bible, well, maybe not. The words you can include women as well as men. Yeah.
Just before you move on, it's related, but you may have heard too that just within the last week there were 17 missionaries in Haiti.
Yes.
Now, they weren't kidnapped for religious reasons; they were kidnapped for
Ransom.
trying to get ransom.
Yeah.
So people who go to a dangerous place, they go there knowing that, as you suggested, going behind the Iron Curtain and the way it was then, they go there to do God's work, and they know it could be dangerous, and sometimes it doesn't work out very well. So Haiti is one of those places. Now,
Right.
in fact, we're trying to bring Jerome into the States for a Emmaus House meeting, and tomorrow they're shutting Haiti down for purposes of trying to get a handle on kidnapping and fuel shortages. And so there have been 600 or 700 kidnappings there this year alone. Most of them have been Haitians, not foreigners or Americans.
Right.
There's a lot of places where you could go, and you go there to champion the Christian cause, and you could find yourself in a pretty desperate
Yeah.
place. So, these were not, people that we know at the 17, but I'm just saying
It's still happening.
still happening.
But it wasn't, you're right, they were religious people, but they weren't kidnapped because of the religion. They were kidnapped for ransom.
Right. Because they're kidnapping fuel truck drivers and teachers and
Yeah.
doctors, and they're just trying to get whatever amount of money they can get. So it's,
How many times you been to Haiti?
I think, about 12 or 13.
Yeah, you're not going this summer or you're not going anytime soon, are you? Nobody's going anytime soon to Haiti. It's in bad shape down there. And think about, well, here I was the chicken. I wasn't going to go behind the Iron Curtain, but David Gatewood lived there. He had to face this kind of thing every day. Think about the people in the church in Haiti, or anybody in Haiti right now, who is scared. Yeah, here a while ago. And they don't really have a functioning government. They really don't. Nothing to speak of. One of the reasons that we've had trouble even getting money down there sometimes is their banks don't operate. They have a thing they call bank, but they don't operate the way banks work pretty much everywhere else in the whole world. You can't just routinely transmit money like we can pretty much anywhere else in the world. And by the way they're doing it now, because we send money down to Haiti every other month directly, is through Western Union, because it's about the only way that we can know that the money is going to get there and going to get in the hands of the person that we want it to be in. It works. We have to pay a little bit every time we send it, but it's still safe. But we were doing it some other ways that were not being safe. And, that wasn't good. Yeah.
I was in Haiti to change American money into Haitian money. There's people out on the street that will do that.
And give you a better rate than you could get anywhere else. Yeah. Bill?
The Ukraine is kind of the same way. It's not as bad as Haiti, but as far as getting money over there and all that kind of stuff, it's still, it's a mess.
It is a mess. The Ukrainian government, Ukraine's a big country. It's bigger than France. But it's not a good, solid, stable government. They're trying. But they were under the control of the communists for so many years, they just have a hard time building a stable society in that part of the world. But it's sad. And you guys know that every year we send $1,000 down to a Church of Christ in Texas, and they help out in in the Ukraine, okay? I didn't know for years that when we sent this money what it was actually being used for. And then they sent something over here and found out that a lot of that money that we were sending was being used for people to have heat in their homes. And it's because of Russia keeps wanting to control the old satellites. And one of the way, you know what I mean by old satellites? The countries that were communist, like Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria and the Ukraine, they want to keep trying to control them as much as they do. The Ukraine doesn't have gas or oil to speak of, and so they import gas and oil from Russia. And when Russia feels like they turn off the pipe. And these people in Ukraine often run out of heat because they're heating by gas a lot of times. And so this money that we send down to the church is them providing money to get other forms of heat or pay for the oil that they can get into the country so that these people don't freeze to death in the winter.
And they're just poor.
Yeah, and they're just poor. Yeah.
Even before Russia was in control of that, Mary would call and say, hey, can we get the money for the heat? It's about time we start to get cold.
Sure. And they would use the money for some other things, they said, but a good sizable portion of it was for heat, for people that are otherwise going to be very, very cold in the winter. Not good. And Russia's still doing this. This Nord Stream pipe, I'm getting into something. It's 10:30. I wasn't going to talk about any of this stuff. This pipe that they're going to run from Russia directly over to Germany under the waters of the Baltic Sea, I guess. Everybody knows what's going on here. The Ukraine is a transit for gas and oil coming through the Ukraine going to Europe. And this is going to put another way for the Russians to put pressure on the Ukraine by saying, we're not going to be sending money through the Ukraine. Well, why does that matter to the Ukrainians? Because the Ukrainian government gets some money from the Russians for doing the transporting of the oil and gas through the country. And they're saying, we're going to skip you, and then, you won't have so much money. In other words, it's more power. And they're not hiding this. They say it openly that this is what they're doing. Sounds like I'm talking politics here, so I got to stop. I really didn't think when I was going to talk to you about this, lay down the life for our brethren, that we would be talking about this at 10:30. But that's okay, It's important. And it was important in the first century. Because guess what? There were some Christians in the first century that saw their Christian brothers and sisters in need and wouldn't help them. And so you got the question, how does the love of God abide in him that acts that way? And the answer is, the love of God does not abide in him. So, little children, let us not love with word or with tongue, but in deed and truth. In other words, care about people and show it. Don't just talk about it. Any comments down through verse 18? Okay, we got a little bit of time. I'd like to read verses 19 through 24. That'll be to the end of the chapter, end of chapter 3. Okay, you with me? Starting at 1 John 3, verse 19. We shall know by this that we are of the truth, and shall assure our heart before him. In whatever our heart condemns us, for God is greater than our heart and knows all things. Beloved, if our heart does not condemn us, we have confidence before God. And whatever we ask, we receive from him because we keep his commandments and do the things that are pleasing in his sight. And this is his commandment, that we believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another just as he commanded us. And the one who keeps his commandments abides in him, and he in him. And we know by this that he abides in us by the Spirit whom he has given us. Oh, there's a whole bunch of stuff in these verses right here. He's again talking to the good Christians. He's telling them how they should live and how they should be. So let's do this a little bit verse by verse. And by the way, we need to read verses 19 and 20 together, because that's one sentence. And then we need to read verses 21 and 22 together. So just 19 and 20, which is one sentence. We shall know by this that we are of the truth, and shall assure our heart before him. In whatever our heart condemns us, for God is greater than our heart and knows all things. Okay, we shall know by this that we are of the truth. I'm not sure if that says in the NIV or whatever you have, but what is this? What is that talking about? Love. It's talking about the prior verse. Love the brethren. Don't just say it, live it. Okay? So by us loving the brethren that we are of the truth, and shall assure our heart before him. In whatever our heart condemns us, for God is greater than our heart and knows all things. Now, the next verse we're going to talk about our heart does not condemn us. So in verse 20, serious question here, what does it mean when it says, in whatever our heart condemns us? And that's a good translation. What does that, take a guess, think. What do you think that means? Oh, Nathan's not in here, or he'd have had his hand up. I'm sorry? Okay, let's take a short vote. How many people think Wally's correct when he says, if we know we're doing wrong? Come on. Yeah. Thank you for a few hands. I agree with Wally. No, put it down, Nathan. Yeah, see? You put your hand up, didn't know the question. Yeah, don't try to take away from what the verse says. In whatever our heart condemns us. It really it means what it says right there. If our heart is condemning us, it's saying our heart is telling us that we're not right in some way. And by the way, our heart, we use that word that way sometimes. Heart is the seat of the feelings or emotions or whatever. But in the Bible here, when it says heart, can you think of another different word that we would more likely use here? That's an open-ended question, but conscience, yes. If your conscience condemns you, what are you saying to yourself?
It's impossible for God to save you.
Yeah, but take God out of it right here. I messed up again.
The same thing, but
I messed up again. Okay. Now, in the next verse, when it says, if our heart does not condemn us, it means the opposite of that. It means our conscience is saying, you're doing okay here. Okay. So in this verse, when it says, in verse 20, and whatever our heart condemns us, what's that mean in this context? If it's saying if you know you've messed up, if you know, well, messed up how? What's he saying to these people here in 1 John?
You know you messed up, God certainly does.
Yeah, but more specifically, remember, what other verses talking before? We read verse 11 or 10 through 18. What was it talking about? Loving people and loving them in action. These verses are not all, just all separate. They're in context. In the context, it seems to me, and you could disagree with this, whatever our heart condemns us, he's saying if you know you've done somebody wrong, maybe by not loving them, maybe as the illustration in verse 17, maybe not helping them when they need help. Now, that generally that says, well, God condemns us. That means we don't get to go to heaven, right? Maybe not. Because what's the second part of the verse? For God is greater than our heart and knows all things. Well, what does that connect to our heart condemning us? If God is greater than our heart and knows all things, what is that saying about what God knows? He knows our heart. He knows our heart as well or better than we know it. He knows if we've done wrong and mistreated somebody, what's really in our heart. To me, it's saying that God knows if we're being just plain mean or evil, or if we just goofed up. He knows our real motives, and He understands. Let's read the next two verses. Beloved, if our heart does not condemn us, we have confidence before God. See, in 20, it doesn't say we have confidence, but it says God understands what's really going on. I like these verses partly because it says to me that God always judges fairly. I believe in judgment that there may be people that want to argue with God. Remember in Matthew where Jesus talked about people will come and say, well, we did all these great and wonderful things. Why aren't we being saved? Remember that? God doesn't argue back with them. No, I don't think there's going to be arguing. Because how can you argue with somebody who knows the depth of your soul? You can't. You may want to, but you can't. God is fair, and God will judge people fairly. God judges you fairly, and He'll judge me fairly, and sometimes I need to be judged with mercy and not with justice. Fair enough? Okay, moving along. Verse 21, Beloved, if our brethren does not condemn us, we have confidence before God, and whatever we ask we receive from Him, because we keep His commandments and do the things that are pleasing in His sight. Does that mean that we never sin? No. We've heard very clearly in John that we do sin. All Christians sin. But he's saying that we can have confidence before God, not because we're perfect, but because we're trying to keep His commandments and we're trying to do the things that are pleasing in His sight. Is that something that you can do? Is that something you can do? Is that something you can do? Yes. Perfectly? No. But here's where the confidence can be. Tom, is this the last phrase here? And do the things that are pleasing in His sight. Do those words mean something to you? I'm asking you, there's a reason I'm asking you that question, Tom. Yeah. I'm putting you on the spot, but you're not going to be upset. I've been listening to you pray for 20 years, Tom. And when you pray, you use this phrase, do things that are pleasing in His sight, many, many times. When I read this verse, I thought of you. You use that phrase all the time in your prayers. And it's a good phrase. Yeah. It's a good phrase. It's a general phrase, but it's showing the desire to please God in everything that we do. It's a good phrase. So, whatever we ask, we receive from God. Whatever we ask, we receive from God. I want a new car. Am I going to get a new car tomorrow? No. That's not the kinds of things he's talking about. He's talking about the things that God knows that we need, and that we actually need, not want. It's not a get-rich-quick scheme. And notice how he says how this is true. Because we keep his commandments, and we do the things that are pleasing in his sight. We want to obey God, and we want to please God. Now, we work that out in our lives, how we talk, how we live, how we pay our taxes, and a few other things, But we're wanting to do right by the world. We're wanting to do right by God. Verse 23. And this is his commandment, that we believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another just as he commanded us. I want to take you back to a verse that we read earlier. Go back to 1 John 2, verse 7, 8. We spent some time on these verses, and I thought about bringing it down to this verse that I just read, but I thought, let's do that when we get to it. Verse 7 and 8. Beloved, I am not writing a new commandment to you, but an old commandment which you have heard from the beginning. The old commandment is the word which you have heard. On the other hand, I am writing a new commandment to you, which is true in him and in you, because the darkness is passing away, and the true light is already shining. And at that time, when I read those two verses, 1 John 2, 7 and 8, I said, but what is the command? Because he says new and old command, but he doesn't say what the command is, does he? Really? And I thought, well, maybe it goes back to verse 4, 5, and 6, where it talks about the love of God and abides in him ought to walk in the same manner as he walked. But here it talks about the new and old command, and it doesn't really say what the command is, does it? Well, here, down halfway through the book, he says this is his command. And what's the command? Believe in Christ, love one another. How about that? Now, having said that, do you find this phrase new command someplace else in the Bible? You know the answer to that's going to be yes. Well, where do you find it? Turn over with me to John 13. Who wrote John 13? John, same guy. John 13. Go down to verse 34. A new commandment. 34. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you should also love one another. Isn't that amazing? He talks about a new commandment in John and says love one another, and he talks about a new commandment later on and says love one another. And that's not the only place it is here. Turn over a page to John 15, 12 and 17. 15, 12. 15:12. This is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. 17. This I command you, that you love one another. There aren't that many times in the gospel that he says, where Jesus says, I'm commanding you. But right here, he says it a couple of times to his apostles. And one time he says a new commandment. You don't think he hadn't heard him say that before? Sure he had. But the word new here is an emphasis. And he uses the same word in 1 John, a new commandment, to talk about the same thing. How you treat each other. And he's trying to say how important it is. Verse 23 again. Just as he commanded us. In 1 John 3:11, it talked about love one another, but he said, which you heard from the beginning. And I said, how did these Christians hear it from the beginning? Well, they heard it from Paul, they heard it from John, right? But down here in this verse, as he commanded us. And Jesus himself, that's where it shows in the Bible, where Jesus himself commanded us. One other thing in verse 23. It's 15 till. I'm going to take 1 minute and do this last thing, and then we got to stop. I was run out of time. Rats. Okay, verse 23. And this is his commandment, that we believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another just as he commanded us. We believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ. What does that mean? Believe in the name of his Son? Maybe the authority? Yeah. Go back over to John chapter 3, to the most famous verse in the Bible, which is John 3:16. Okay? John 3:16. For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him. Now, go to verse 18. We could read 17, but go to verse 18. He who believes in him, that's Jesus, is not judged. He who does not believe has been judged already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. In verse 18, the first part of the verse says, he who believes in him. The second part of the verse says, he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. Are those two things saying two different things there? No. When it says in verse 18, he who believes in him, Christ, is saying the same thing as he who believes in the name of the Son of God. It's another way of saying he who believes in him. Now you may say, well, why do you tell us about a little detail like that? Do you know, I keep talking about the ways that people goof up reading the Bible. Well, here's one more. We may talk about this a little bit next week, but I'm going to say it here and then we'll close for the day. There are people who believe that if you say the name of Jesus, if you say, Jesus, what happens? By saying that word. No, maybe, but more specifically, a miracle. And there's all kinds of preachers. If you go home today and listen on radio and TV, you'll hear them saying that, in the name of Jesus, I heal you, or something like that. And it's a magic word. By saying the word, something good happens. And they'll say that. Say Jesus, expect a miracle, this kind of thing. That's not what the verse is saying. To believe in the name of Jesus is the same thing as believing in Jesus. And yeah, I think it has the idea of accepting his authority or power or who he is and stuff like that. But it is not naming a magic word. And there's churches after churches that teach it exactly that way. Okay, it's almost 10 till. I apologize. Maybe we'll start 5 minutes later. Bye-bye.